Welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint Ultramarines just like the box art. There's a lot to cover in this video, so let's get started. So firstly, I've primed the model using Chaos Black Spray. As you can see, it's quite speckled in places. However, this amount of coverage is more than enough for the paint to adhere to. It also minimizes the risk of unwanted texture and filling any details. So first I'm going to start with the blue armour, and for this I will use Macragge blue. I'm applying this by airbrush for speed, however you could also apply it by brush. Here you can see the usual sub-assembly that I would do if I was painting this for the box art. I find it much easier to focus on individual parts like this, and it also allows me to move around each component more easily. Now that we have a nice base coat, I like to go around and black out the undersuit and other details that won't be blue. It's a good idea to do this early on, as any mistakes are much easier to tidy. Once that's done, I start to shade the armour with a mix of 2 parts Cantor blue to 1 part black. This is a very controlled line shade, and I thin this down to around 50-50 with water to ensure it flows into the recesses and panel lines. Now it does pay to be more patient with this stage and apply as many coats as you need to get a nice neat line. However, if you do make any mistakes, you can always go back and tidy with the Macragge blue. So I continued to do this for all the other parts of the armour until there was a nice consistent shading around all the recesses. And here we have the shading stage finished. Now it's on to the first highlight stage, and for this I'm going to use a mix of 50-50 Macragge and Calgar blue. So one quick tip to help you work out how thick to go with this stage is to apply a thinner highlight first and then to roughly double the width with another pass. This highlight is applied around every edge of the armour, and although it's a subtle first highlight, it's still important to keep it as consistent as you can. So there's a couple of general tips for more controlled edge highlighting. It is firstly to make sure that the brush is not overloaded. I often use the side of my thumb to remove any excess paint and to get a nice sharp point before applying to the model. Next is to find a bracing position that is rigid and comfortable. For me, this is bracing my hand holding the miniature on the desk and then resting my painting hand against this, which creates a comfortable position which limits any shakiness. So maybe it's important to mention here that the box art or Eavy Metal method of painting Space Marines is a very stylized, clean and defined look. It's not particularly meant to be realistic in terms of lighting, but it was developed for the purposes of showing off the product to look its best from every angle. Another requirement is that it has to be replicated by a team of painters and remain consistent throughout the range. So in order to really perfect this style, it takes a lot of brush control, and there's nothing quite like developing this brush control than just trying to paint Space Marines as sharp as you can. Despite having painted many of these for the box art over the years, it's always good to paint a refresher every once in a while to improve these core skills. So for brushes, I'm mostly using Winsor & Newton Series 7 miniature size ones, specifically the miniature series, because they have a more triangular shape, which makes them great for more precise work like this. After a brush becomes more worked with, it will often reach a peak before dying and becoming unusable, and some of the brushes on this video are on the verge of that, however they're still usable for most detail work. I'm also not very particular on the size of brushes for edge highlighting, basically whatever will get the job done and has a good enough point. A larger brush will have a larger reservoir, however it can be less precise, so use whatever size you feel the most comfortable with. So for the next highlight stage here, I'm going to use Calgar Blue. When painting finer highlight stages like this, I find it useful to move the miniature around and try to angle the brush straight onto the corner, moving the brush towards me. This helps to create a much more comfortable and natural movement when highlighting. So with the majority of the body done now, I move on to the other parts. The backpack and head here have some very small vents. These can be tricky because we need to keep the highlights fine enough that we don't change the overall tone of these areas. Magnification headsets can really help with this, so I recommend looking into that if you struggle. So here we have the head and body finished up to the second stage, and you can really start to see the armor is taking shape now. Now it's time to move on to the final highlight stage, which is Fenrisian Grey. So this needs to be the most precise highlight stage yet. We're aiming for the laser sharp lines that the Eavy Metal style is famous for. So you might occasionally see me use the side of the brush to highlight. This method can be less precise, however, if you think of it like a very controlled overbrush, where the paint is slightly drying and I'm just lightly touching it enough to pick up the edge. With the body now done up to the final stage, lastly I move on to the head and backpack. Finally, I applied some dot highlights using blue horror to the sharpest corners of the armor panels. So now the armor is complete, it's time to move on to the gunmetal. I've base coated this using Vallejo dark aluminium, but you could also use Citadel lead belcher instead. I like to keep the gunmetals nice and simple, so then I shaded this using Basilicanum grey contrast paint. So I would usually just use something like Nuln Oil here, however I've been enjoying using the contrast to shade metallics recently. They're a bit more concentrated and easier to work with. I thin this down and glaze this several times until I get the desired amount of shading. For the edge highlight here, I use Vallejo Model Air Silver. This is my regular go-to for metal highlights, as it's nice and smooth and flows nicely for fine highlights. However, you could also use Stormhose Silver or any other bright silver instead. As with any other area of the miniature, I try to keep these metallics as neat and tidy as I can. So lastly, I used the Vallejo silver to carefully pick out the rivets on the backpack. There's something oddly satisfying here about applying these final details. And here we have the finished effect. So next I base coated the chest aquila and shoulder trims with Retributor armour. This was then followed by a soft shade of Gore Grunter Fur contrast paint. I thinned this down to roughly 50-50 with water and applied a few coats, building up the shading over the gold. And continuing with the Gore Grunter, I'm glazing this into the corners of the trim. For the deep shade, I used a mix of Doombull and black. This I concentrated more towards the deepest recesses. It's important to build up enough definition between each feather, and after that was dry, I reapplied the gold base coat, leaving the shaded recesses. I then added Vallejo Model Air Silver into the bright gold for the subsequent highlight stages. However, again, you could also just use Liberator and Stormhost Silver. I added more silver into the feathers until I'm left with a final highlight of silver just on the tips of the feathers. And again with the shoulder trim, I just added a nice sharp highlight using bright gold and silver. So for the weapon casing, I'm going to use a very simple neutral black recipe. For the first stage highlight, I'm going to use Corvus Black. Before this colour existed, I would use a mix of Eshin Grey and Black instead. This is quite a subtle stage, and we are applying this in a similar thickness to the first stage on the armour. The next stage is a 50-50 mix of Eshin and Dawnstone. And as with the armour second stage, we're applying this as a much sharper line highlight. Finally, I applied the sharpest edge highlight with Administratum Grey. Again, I'm lightly using the side of the brush to pick up the edge. It's much easier in this case to use the side of the brush for these long straight edges, provided the angles are sharp enough. I then applied some dot highlights to the sharpest corners using grey cere, or you could also just use white. And lastly, I picked out the rivets using silver. For the leather, I base coated it using Rhinox hide. This is then shaded with a very thin wash of black paint. Next, I carefully glazed Doomball brown around the edges of the leather. Originally, the box art for the Primaris Ultramarines had black leather, but this was changed to this nice warm leather which adds a lot more interest to the scheme and also looks good next to the blue armour. Once that's done, I applied the first real highlight stage using Mournfang brown. These diagonal lines are mostly just a style choice. The texture on the leather here is very subtle, however this helps it to look more bold and graphic, and personally I like the look. Next I applied a sharp edge highlight of XV88. This is quite a large jump, however as long as you keep the line sharp it will look fine. Finally, I applied the last edge highlight using Carrick Stone. And here we have all of the finished leather. I repeated this step for the belt and for the other pouches on this marine. So for the lenses, I base coated them first with Mephiston Red. I carefully applied this a few times, leaving some black showing in the corner of the lens. I then highlighted this using Wild Rider Red. Rather than just using a line highlight, I carefully blended this into the lower edge of the lens to brighten it up. Next, this was highlighted with Fire Dragon Bright. This is a much finer edge highlight around the bottom of the lens. Lastly, I added some white into the Fire Dragon and applied a finer highlight to the bottom corner of the lens. I glazed a tiny bit of cornum black into the top corner to deepen the shading. Then I added a small dot highlight of white to the top corner of the lens. So here we have the finished head, and the Ultramarine is completed. If you've enjoyed this content, consider hitting that subscribe button and perhaps joining the Patreon. It's still early days, but there's already some great tutorials on there, and I've just added a new tier which will have 2 extra videos per month. Thank you to all the current patrons for your continued support, and thank you for watching.